Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of the SJX podcast. I'm here with Brandon, and today we are going to talk about some of the new watches that were recently launched and some of the watches that we're going under the hammer in the upcoming spring season in Geneva. So, Brandon, let's start with the Breguet that was just launched last week, the first watch in Breguet's anniversary collection. What do you think of it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Soon after it came out, I actually got a text message from one of our listeners asking me exactly that question. What do you think about this watch? And at the time, I'd actually I was still catching up on the news, and I hadn't really made up my mind on it yet. But it's definitely a watch that I am really excited about, and it's growing on me the more that I think about it, the more that I look at it. Really excited to see it in person, see the enamel work. I've seen some really high resolution photos. A domed enamel dial is pretty challenging, um, but really pleased with this direction for the company. I think that I certainly hope that we'll see more for the 250th anniversary. Like this doesn't seem on its own to live up to that moment. I think back to the Tour de Lille from Vacheron in 2005 for that brand's 250th anniversary, and I think I'll be looking for more from Breguet this year. But certainly, this is you know uh, one of the few Breguets of my lifetime that I can imagine wearing. I think that the case is a lot more contemporary and appropriate for today's tastes. And yet, I think the single-handed design, which goes back, even before the kind of the Roth era designs in the Breguet history, just works really well here. And I feel excited about it. What about you?
Yeah. I think I agree with you. Firstly, I think this is a good start. It's a strong start for Breguet for the anniversary. I know for a fact that they will be launching more watches, which I'm guessing will be more complex, and I hope by the end of it they'll have a well-rounded anniversary collection that lives up to the brand's reputation. As for the watch itself, I think it's really well done. I think it shows that the new CEO of Breguet has good taste. Even though he joined the brand only recently, I heard that he gave some he gave some. So this watch was already developed before he joined as CEO, right? It takes a couple of years, but he helped refine the product, and I think you can see that the result is interesting because, like you said, it departs in a way from the recent Breguet aesthetic, but it still looks like a Breguet, which is actually quite a challenge. There are not many brands that can create something that eliminates most of the signature design elements and still feel like the right kind of product, right? This watch doesn't have the fluted case band. It doesn't have the straight lugs. It doesn't have guilloche, and yet it still feels like a Breguet, which I think it is well done in that respect. For me, the price also stood out. Um, when I first saw the price, I thought, oh, this maybe is a bit expensive, but actually in today's market, I think it's actually fairly good value. Uh, a watch like this, honestly, I think has more technical content than some independent watchmakers that are charging more for time-only watches, right? Now you
Hmm.
see so many independent watchmakers selling time-only watches that borrow components from the ETA Unitas or the 7001. They do a lot of finishing, and it's minimum 65, 70,000 francs. The Breguet is like, I don't know, 45,000 francs.
Hmm.
So in comparison, I think it's actually fairly good value, even though the movement is not entirely new. You can see it's built on the architecture of the original tradition caliber. But I think all in all, for the quality, and Breguet quality is always good, for the quality and design, I think it's a quite a compelling proposition. I think the only thing I wish they had changed is the fact that this is not a limited edition. It will be produced in limited numbers, But I think for an anniversary watch, they should just they should have made it a limited edition to make it a bit more special. Maybe they have other plans that they haven't announced. Like, they just produce it for a year and next year they'll say they stop making it. Who knows?
Yeah, it's an interesting point about it being a limited edition. First of all, I mostly agree with you on the pricing. I think I had a little bit of sticker shock initially just because of where in my mind I kind of think about the La Tradition watch being priced, and in terms of the technical content, there's quite a bit that is very similar. Obviously, this takes that a little bit further in terms of some of the hand engraving and finishing, but um, that was just sort of where my mind was anchored on price. So in that context, it felt expensive. As I have continued to think about the attributes of the watch, I've more normed to where you are in terms of my assessment of the pricing. Something that I think is really important here is the single hand design. I think that not only does it appropriately call back to the original subscription watches, but it would be a lot more boring.
Yeah. I agree with you entirely. I personally I appreciate the single hand design a lot. We discussed it briefly. One of our upcoming projects collaborations with a brand is a single hand watch, which I showed you at Watches and Wonders.
Hmm.
So I've always liked the single hand design, even though it's like the least practical thing you can have on a watch, because more or less you can only tell the time to approximately 10 to 15 minutes. So you can not actually tell the time accurately at any time. But it's a very to me, it's a very attractive way of telling the time. And also it maximizes the purpose of a wristwatch today, which is not to tell the time, but to look nice.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah, it
it'll
makes a
also
lot of
save,
sense.
yeah, it'll save people from sending their watch in for service because it's running, 15 seconds
Exactly.
fast a day. So,
Exactly.
no,
Yeah.
I think, in this modern era of, highly advanced watches, at Watches and Wonders, we saw the Grand Seiko UFA that's, 20 seconds per year, the Rolex Land Dweller that's, rated to ±2, but it's probably even more accurate than that, using really advanced silicon components. Likewise, the Patek Philippe watches are basically all rated now to, from -1 to +2 seconds per day using, kind of plug and play silicon components. I think that this is kind of a rejection of that, not only in the fact that Breguet kind of turning its back on its own recent history and use of silicon, which I approve of here in a big way.
Mm,
I think the big sweeping Nivacron overcoil looks great and is definitely the right choice here. But even just by getting rid of some of this resolution in terms of what you can read in terms of the time, I like that they're kind of walking back from this precipice of quartz-like accuracy. I mean, that seems kind of strange to say, but like sometimes it feels like the industry is getting too high tech, and
right,
that and it's kind of eroding some of the
right,
romance from it.
right.
And I think that this is sort of a real statement about, you know, me mechanical watchmaking in a traditional way.
Yeah. I agree with you entirely. I think for me, actually, as a collector, I would much rather have an appealing, interesting, unique watch that keeps so time than a boring, ugly watch that keeps time that's spot on. And I think often this is sort of missing the forest for the trees in
Hmm.
collecting, where people talk about accuracy, they talk about finishing and anglage and perlage and all these things, and guilloche that's done by hand versus done by machine. And a watch can have any one of these qualities, but at the end, it's just not an attractive watch. It misses the point. It's a failure.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, just kind of moving from the dial to the case. I think that really smart here for Breguet to again kind of turn its back a little bit on its recent history with the fluted case band, the straight lugs that for me, just I never worked for never has worked for me on my wrist. It's always
Mm,
made me feel it's always made me feel like I'm too young for it, even as I've gotten older. Whereas, this is immediately a watch I'm looking forward to
uh,
putting on my wrist.
uh,
And I think it kind of does call back to some of their um, pieces they did in the early part of the 20th century.
yeah. I think up to even the mid 1950s, you could find Breguets with cases like this.
Hmm.
Um, and I think like based on what you said or what we are saying, the fact that we're actually talking about this in a positive way goes some way to 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 giving Breguet some of the excitement and interest that it had, 20 years ago when the tradition was
Hmm.
launched. The tradition was launched, I think, in 2005. And it was really exciting when it was launched. It was incredible. I mean, today it's unimaginable that, everybody at the time, everybody was talking about it. A lot of people wanted to buy one. You had to wait to get the tradition. And in
Hmm.
fact, after they launched, Breguet raised the price quite quickly because it was launched and I think it was too cheap and they sold too many. And I don't know, maybe a couple of months after they raised the price because it turned out to be more expensive to produce. And yeah, Nicholas Hayek, I remember in some interviews he mentioned it that this is costing us too much. We have to raise the price. And even when the
Hmm.
price was raised, it was still quite affordable. I think an interesting benchmark is it was launched, I think, in the same year as the FP Journe Chronomètre Souverain. And both
Yeah, oh 05.
watches, yep, both watches were exciting watches at the time. And it's interesting to see how divergent the paths have been for these two watches that more or less retailed for the same price at the time. I think maybe, I don't know, 17, 18, 20,000 US or
Hmm.
Swiss francs, more or less. The same retail, similar audience, I think, at the time, similar levels of interest. And it's how different the paths that have been taken by both the brands and the watches, in the 20 years since.
Yeah, definitely a divergence in the outcomes for those two pieces. But I think it's a good segue to the movement architecture
Yeah,
of this new subscription, which does really call back to not only the original subscription pieces from Breguet's own time, but that architecture that was brought back with the launch of the La Tradition. Was always a movement that really stood out to me as kind of the one piece in the collection, at least at the time that I was getting into watches, that reminded me of what I had seen in museums
yeah,
of, early Breguet work. And so always really struck me as like, this should be the basis of the brand. And I love, I was so excited when I saw the pictures of the subscription turned over to see that central barrel
yeah,
architecture, the details like the kind of the proprietary parachute shock
yeah,
system, the overcoil, a metallic hairspring,
yeah,
um, the kind of the star-shaped wheels, and just the color palette, the textures, all just really
yeah,
felt really feel right. And it's it's one of those watches where I think if you were to come across it, not even knowing the context, but if you were to come across this watch in 50 years, 100 years, it would speak for itself.
yeah,
You would turn it over and you would say, if you had any knowledge of watches, you would say this is something unique. This is not
yeah,
like everything else. This is not a Puceau
yeah,
7001
yeah,
or a Frederick Piguet movement.
yeah,
It's very distinctive, and so I
yeah,
think that I really hope that we see more of this from the
yes,
brand. I think we will. I mean, I think that this is actually a trend that we've talked about. A couple years ago when I wrote the review of the Saxonia Thin, I kind of
mm,
mentioned how so much of I think what made the rebirth of Longa successful was that the historical DNA could be seen in the actual architecture and construction of the movements
yeah,
instead of just being a name on the dial. And I kind of painted a contrasting example with Arnold and Son at the time, which is interesting because this year Arnold and Son launched the
mm,
tourbillon at Watches and Wonders that does really heavily. lean in and kind of try to replicate that original Arnold Breguet tourbillon that was was made at the time. I think that seeing that, seeing this piece, I think this. I hope that this is a trend because it really shouldn't require that much R&D on
Yeah,
behalf of the brands to
yeah,
make the movements look better. And I think that it will create more diversity. I think it'll create more um, interesting conversations about finishing because instead of being about execution, it will be
yeah,
about choice of
yeah,
style, choice of textures, choice of layout,
yeah,
choice of depth. I think that these are much more interesting avenues for us to be talking about and excited
yeah,
about than simply um, how many angles
yeah.
or how the hands are
Yeah.
polished.
I mean, you make this point. It's a very good point, and I think an interesting thought experiment. Imagine if this Breguet tradition, as it is entirely, was made instead by young independent watchmaker who just set up a brand, who studied in France and now is selling his watches on subscription basis. He exhibits in the HCI in the basement beside Four Seasons. He would launch this, he would sell it for 120,000 francs, and he would sell 100 watches as pre-order. Easy, right? But this at 45,000, you still see on social media complaining that people is too expensive. So I think it just shows like I said, sometimes people miss the forest for the trees. But on the topic of movement architecture, I think you made an interesting point also about the new Christopher Ward, the C12, which you
Hmm.
like.
Yes,
Yeah,
I do like the C12. Yeah, I think that's a good segue. I think that this is an example where they took a movement that was uh, functional but ugly and made it functional but cool. And it was real, on the obviously they inverted the oscillator and the escapement to the dial side. They added a free sprung balance, which you definitely have to do if you're going to put it on the dial. So bravo to Christopher Ward for that. And then on the back, they took basically the same layout as the I believe it's the SH21, if I'm not mistaken, and just simply by redoing the bridge architecture, we're able to make it look awesome. And it's one of those things where it's like if you're going to build a building, at least hire a good architect so that it looks good because it's the same number of floors, the same real estate, the same construction costs. In general, you can have two vastly different outcomes in appearance just by having attention to the design. And I think this is the watchmaking equivalent of that. And I hope that kind of stirs things up a little bit, which it should at its pricing, um, which is pretty aggressively low for what it is, in my opinion, which is an opinion not having seen it yet in person, but certainly hope to see it soon.
yeah, I agree. I think the movement, as you say, it is very interesting. Personally, I don't like the design of the watch, but I think what they've done with the movement at that price is very interesting. It's a very appealing movement. And I think it also shows that sometimes it's not that difficult to think out of the box to create something a bit more interesting. Like you said, the basics, the fundamentals of the movement are descended from the SH21. So it's not actually that complex, especially I think today when you can reconstruct the movement on the computer.
Hmm.
You could do really interesting things. But I think sometimes brands they miss this because I think increasingly, especially at the big brands, many people who develop movements are purely engineers, who might be brilliant engineers, but who do not really understand the aesthetics of a movement, who do not understand historical watchmaking, who haven't seen vintage movements, who haven't seen movements that were designed with style in mind. And I think that's why increasingly many new calibers feel like they are made by engineers rather than watchmakers.
Hmm. Well, yeah, and I mean historically there was such a limitation on case size. That was always a huge constraint. Like Stephen McDonald could never have gotten away with making the designs that he's come up with 50 years ago when watches all had to be 34 or 35
Yeah.
millimeters, you couldn't have a double chronograph,
Yeah.
in that footprint. Certainly not with their technology at the time. So there was always such a limitation on space. I think that they just thought design is just not even something we're going to worry about. And I think that that tradition, as has just kind of lived on as the status quo in what is, a pretty conservative industry in terms of that. But it's nice to see now that people are turning an eye to that, thanks to the work of, the great contemporary independent watchmakers that have made their movements so architecturally spectacular. It's, you know, Grubel Force, crawled so that, Christopher
Yeah.
Ward can run.
Yeah.
They were like, oh, a movement does not have to look like this. It can look awesome.
Yeah.
And, it just shook things up. And kind of like we see with all manner of watchmaking technology, it diffuses across each across a tier, across more brands, and then kind of down through the pricing spectrum. So it'll be interesting to see if we get more competition on these more aesthetic grounds within the movement construction.
Yeah, I think we will start to see more of that, especially as brands that are the smaller brands, even micro brands, uh, pick up on this and they realize what consumers want. And more importantly, I think it is the suppliers that supply all these brands, supplies in Switzerland and also in China. Once they learn how to do this, they will just start doing more and more of it. And in a few years, we'll see it everywhere.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to require collectors to uh, obtain a slightly different skill set in how we approach and think about and look at watches. We'll need to, continue to think critically about where these different movements are coming from. We'll need to think critically about how we assess finishing in an age where maybe we don't see as much Geneva stripes or
Um,
inner angles. Certainly when I think about the Christopher Ward, like that's not that there would be inner angles on a movement like that, but even if that movement were made and finished by, a company that could afford to do so, aesthetically, it's not in that Swiss tradition that gave rise to inner angles on these, swooping, elegant bridges. This is a much more kind of in your face, brutalist type of design. And so as collectors will need to be open-minded about how do we critically assess the artistic merit of these products that aren't conforming to our aesthetic codes that we've all gotten used to.
yeah. On the topic of aesthetic codes, I think this is actually a good bridge into another of the topics that we wanted to discuss, which is some of the watches coming up in the spring auctions
Hmm.
in Geneva. Uh, a lot of them actually, especially at Philips, are not wristwatches, right? They are not in a sense conforming to the tastes and codes of today. They are clocks, they are pocket watches, but a lot of them are very interesting horologically.
Yeah, I mean, a really stacked lineup at Philips. I mean, certainly starting again with Breguet, definitely a big Breguet episode, but the Sympathique number one that not only is a tremendous piece in the history of contemporary Breguet, but also sort of a who's who of independent watchmaking in the 1980s.
Yeah, it is definitely one of the biggest lots of the sale. Um, And yeah, I think one of the things for me that stands out about this watch, which I never realized until I talked to someone a collector who was sort of looking at bidding on this. He looked at it and he told me actually this is an incredibly impractical creation because the wristwatch that mounts on the clock has its strap secured by screws, and you have to remove the strap each time you mount the wristwatch on the clock. So
Interesting.
if you look at
But it
and
also fits into a pocket watch case though, right? Which is sort of
which
the
you
original
which you also have to take
idea.
it out from the case to mount it into the clock.
Okay.
So actually, in terms of practicality, it wasn't well thought out, but the mechanics in the clock are really ingenious.
Yeah, I mean it's and just for the listeners who might not be, fully up to speed on these, back in the day, Abraham Louis Breguet made a few of, a small number of these clocks that were essentially master clocks that would both adjust, wind, and set the time on a pocket watch that the owner would essentially dock into this. So, in a sense, it was sort of like a docking station for your pocket watch that would wind it and set it and even adjust the adjust the length of the hairspring via a curb pin regulator to make it to make sure that it was running appropriate for you, is ready to go when you're heading out the door. Um, and then in this one was made in the 1980s. Breguet collaborated with THA, which was a kind of an early, I would say almost incubator for complications, run by F.P. Journe, Denis Flageolet, and some others that created this piece very much in the style, in it, material, quality, craft, really in every way, a true spiritual successor to the original Abraham Louis Breguet pieces. So it's a really just tremendous object that I think is deeply meaningful as a piece of history. Full stop.
Yeah. And for listeners also who are not familiar with the sympathetic, I think it's useful to know that the most expensive Breguet ever sold was was an antique sympathetic clock that was made for the Duke of Orleans. It sold for, I think, 6 or 7 million, maybe 15 years ago. Uh, and that, even today, it's still one of the most expensive timepieces ever sold. So it shows how important the original sympathetic is in the history of watchmaking. And this is the most important modern version of the sympathetic clock. That sort of reproduces the technical features of the original, but it's also entirely in solid gold. The Breguet Sympathique, the modern day Breguet Sympathique limited edition clocks were gold plated brass. But this clock is entirely 18 karat yellow gold.
How much do you think it weighs? Does it say in the listing?
It doesn't, but I'll see it soon when I'm in Geneva. I'm guessing it weighs like 1 or 2 kilos, like 2 to 4 pounds, I'm guessing, because the entire structure of the clock is solid gold. Even if the interior is hollow, it's still a lot of
Hmm.
gold.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely exciting, but it's not the only impressive clock coming up.
No, I think the other impressive clock is the Cartier Portico clock, which is entirely different from the Breguet, but at the same time, it sort of reflects a particular era of collecting. When the Breguet was sold in the early 90s, Cartier similarly was hot. And this, the Portico clocks are considered, in a sense, the holy grail of Cartier clocks. All of them were unique, all were handmade, all were made of very expensive materials, right? Mineral stones, diamonds, mother of pearl. And I think the Breguet and the Portugal clock will the two of them, either one of them will end up being the most expensive lots sold at auction in spring. I cannot think of anything that will go for more than this. The Cartier is very impressive. It's actually very, very large. Yeah, it's really like the ultimate status symbol to have on your desk.
And I think, unlike the Breguet, which is sort of a fairly contemporary timepiece, kind of at, made at the dawn of the era that we're still in, of a, return to appreciating mechanical watchmaking and finishing and craft. This was made in the 20s, at really the uh, kind of the one of the golden ages for Cartier in terms of its own design history. It was a very
Yeah.
extravagant time.
Yeah, it's very extravagant. It was before the Great Depression. It really clocks like these really captured the spirit of Cartier at the time, and also explain why it is even today the brand is so successful. Because in that era, basically the few decades around that era was when Cartier created the style and the concepts and themes that even define the brand today. What the brand does today is essentially the same as what it used to do. So that was the defining era for the brand.
Yeah, it'll be I'm really excited to, follow this auction. I won't be there in the room, but I'll definitely be following along online for this one.
Yeah. I mean, on the topic of clocks, Christie's also has a very intriguing Breguet clock. It is a Breguet. It is basically the equivalent of a Rolex GMT Master from 200 years ago. It is a Breguet travel clock. It's like a small little brass clock with handles that you put in a small box, and you took it along with you and traveled back then. I mean, back then you traveled by horse and carriage. So you carry this thing with you in the carriage. And I will tell you what the time was. The one being sold at Christie's is a very early travel clock, sold in 1809, which is yeah, more than 200 years ago. And it has a calendar, the time, and an alarm. So and a quarter repeater. So it's like a at the time I would guess it must have been a very advanced travel watch, like what a Rolex GMT Master with silicon escapement is today. Um, and it's just a really interesting example of how much life and watchmaking has evolved.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, this is like, in a way, I'm thinking about traveling today over long distances, looking at your flight path on the screen of
Yeah,
the seat back in front of you on a
yeah,
plane. It's counting, it's giving you all kinds of information. But it's counting down the time. It's
yeah,
local time, destination time, etc. You know, uh, this was really the kind of the first version of that, trying to give you a way to keep track of your journey.
yeah,
I think oftentimes they were equipped with moon phase as well, just so that they knew how much light they might expect
yeah.
along their journey.
Yeah, it's a really interesting example of historical watchmaking, and I'm curious also to see how much it sells for. I feel a little bit like maybe today's collectors don't really appreciate things like this, but these are actually very important timepieces, and this is an
Hmm.
original Breguet made when Abraham Louis Breguet himself was still alive.
Yeah,
Um,
it's difficult to collect these things. They're the information about them exists typically in a different types of books. They're not covered in the same way. They're hard to they're large. They're hard to store. They're even if you
yeah,
wanted to get into this, like there's so many more barriers to actually doing so than for watches which are small. There's a whole support network
yeah,
for watches globally. You can travel with it easily, whereas these things are, they fulfill a different role in your life, and so I think are a little bit more difficult to understand and appreciate.
yeah. I think for the same reason, there is another interesting watch at Christie's, which is the Breguet Repeater that's owned by Napoleon's sister. I mean, today, you very often in auction catalogs, you see wristwatches owned by celebrities, Paul Newman's Daytona, things like this. When I mean, Napoleon's sister's Breguet pocket watch is a very important, historically important watch, historically significant figure with a strong link to the House of Breguet. As a watch itself, it's also complex. It's in good condition, but again, it's the same thing like you mentioned. It's not so easy to collect things like this today, and I think taste has passed. This is not current with today's taste, so I'm curious to see also where this ends up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we talked earlier about how the new Breguet Souscription really accurately captured the timepieces of that time with its single hand. This is actually a watch that was extremely advanced for its time with
Yeah,
hours, minutes, and
yeah,
seconds on the dial. So, you know, more similar to almost what Breguet's been making for the past 25 or so
Yeah,
years.
yeah. And on the topic of pocket watches, you mentioned also some of the pocket watches at Philips. We were
Yeah.
talking about it, like the Lange Grand Complication.
Yeah, there are a lot of yeah, one German and several British watches, all for the most part powered by Swiss movements, just given the era that they were made, but nonetheless some really exceptional pieces. So it just starting with there's a Lange Grand Complication pocket watch coming up that has a pretty high estimate. So this is split seconds chronograph, perpetual calendar, uh, Grand Sonnerie. One of just nine made, 1908. So before World War One, before even yeah,
Before
a different
everything.
time, a
Yeah.
different time, let's say. Yeah. So this would have been one of the most advanced pieces from that era. Not as advanced as some of the other Lange Grand Complications. The one though the wristwatch was modeled after also had a lightning seconds, which this one does not. This one also has I don't want to say, I don't want to say less attractive, but uh, a more typical bridge architecture, specifically around the split seconds chronograph mechanism. The grand complication that was restored by Lange that the wristwatch was based on had a more distinctive, more interesting bridge architecture. Although we were just talking about this before this episode, probably the same base movement underneath.
Yeah. I think like many of the like many of the other watches we mentioned, this watch captures the taste of the era of collecting.
Hmm.
I think the Philips catalog says it was sold in the late 1980s at Iniken in Zurich, which at the
Hmm.
time was one of the leading auction houses for pocket watches. But as you said, the estimate now is quite high, so it'll be interesting to see whether today's taste still caters for such complicated watches.
Yeah.
The fact that you mentioned the base movements were all Swiss is also notable. Um, just what 2 weeks ago, a week ago, I had a panel in Singapore with Daniela Dufault and Philippe Dufault. Philippe he participated via video because although he was supposed to turn up, he wasn't allowed to board the flight from Frankfurt because his passport didn't have enough validity. I think you need 6 months validity to enter Singapore, and his was at like 3.5 or 4 months. So he couldn't turn up for the panel, but he was tuned in by Zoom. And during the panel, he made a very interesting point because I asked him, why have the watches and movements of the Valet de Joux inspired you? Basically, all of his work is inspired by the movements made in the Valet de Joux in the early 20th century. And he made two interesting points, actually. He said, firstly, the Valet doesn't have many old watch brands. More or less, it only has two old, established major watch brands, which is Jaeger-LeCoultre and Audemars Piguet. Most of the old, established watch brands are in Geneva. And that's because the Valet was mainly the heart of Swiss watchmaking producing movements. The Eboche, the movement blanks were the best in the world. And he made the point that everybody around the world, the Germans, the English, the Swiss, were all buying movements from the same few suppliers in the Valet de Joux, made by the Piguets, the Melans, the Lecours, right? The same, I don't know, dozen names who made basically all the movements, all the high-end movements at the time. And he says this sort of reflected the mastery, the skill, the capability of the Valet at the time. And you can see this in this Lange pocket watch. Well, you can see this in all the Lange Grand Complications ever made because all of them were powered by movements made in the Valet de Joux.
Yeah, and not just Lange, but other Germans, at the time, Union
Yeah.
Glashütte. There was the kind of just known as the Union pocket watch, which
Yes.
was a grand complication made by Audemars Piguet,
Yep.
like just from pretty much from start to finish.
Yes, and also I think it's interesting, like you mentioned, some of the English pocket watches in the Philips auction. All
Hmm.
of them all similarly powered by Swiss movements, but all of them actually look. The irony is that all of these English watches, the movements look like what we perceive as German watches today.
Hmm.
You see the three-quarter plate and so on because the Swiss, I mean, the movements were made for English brands, so they had to customize the movements for English brands.
Yep.
And ironically, the Langer Grand complication looks like what we would think is a Swiss movement today.
Yeah, it has
Uh,
anglage. It has,
exactly,
these big black polished steel levers with inner
exactly,
angles, whereas the British watches, you know, mostly full plate, gilded,
exactly.
no anglage,
So
except
yeah,
on the steel parts around the wheels. And then you've got, you know, big, elaborate, flowing script, talking about supplying the Admiralty
yeah,
or
exactly.
whomever. But nonetheless, extremely high quality pieces. A lot of these, um, or maybe not a lot of them, but the beautiful overcoils, variable inertia balances. Some of them also have auxiliary regulation, but these are some of the finest watches produced in their day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these are really they represent the best of watchmaking at a specific point in time. And it'll be interesting to see the level of appreciation for such watches today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, any other closing thoughts on the upcoming auction season?
Well, there's one watch that really stood out to me. It's not something I can afford, but it's the Vacheron Minute Repeater wristwatch at Philips. It's a very simple watch. It's platinum with diamond indices, and it's one of the few minute repeating wristwatches that Vacheron made in the 20th century. And I'm sure it'll sell for a huge amount, but it's just a really, really nice looking watch with a really nice movement. And this watch is interesting because it hasn't been sold before publicly. It's never come to auction. It comes from the original family. And apparently it's in really good condition. I haven't seen it yet. I'll see it when I'm in Geneva next week. But I think this is just a really nice looking watch that captures everything about high, captures everything that defines high-end mid 20th century Swiss watchmaking.
Hmm. Yeah, and has some interesting provenance coming from the original owner's family in Mexico.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I'm sure it will sell for a lot of money. Who knows, maybe even Vacheron will buy it for its museum because it's a very important watch.
Hmm.
So I think but at the same time, even though I say it'll sell for a lot of money, in comparison to say to say the watches that are popular today, it's actually not a lot of money. Even if this sells for 600,000 or 700,000, that's still less than some Richard Milles. It's still less than some FP Jones. It's still
And
less than
it's less than some Richard Milles in the same auction. They've got
yeah,
the Ferrari
exactly.
Ultra Thin that I think has a low estimate of like 800, which
Exactly. So, even if it's 600,000, it's I guess in some ways it's still value because it's a really, really, really nice watch. And the movement is top class.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I think people talk about revisiting the concept of like the Holy Trinity. Is it still correct that it's Patek, AP, and Vacheron or whatever? But I think that watches like this are a good reminder of why that terminology was coined in the first place and why it's still relevant, because there was a period of time when they were really the only
yeah,
flag bearers of this level of craft
yeah.
that kept the supplier networks and
Ah,
enamelers and gem setters and finishers and all of those specialist trades, really kept them not afloat because most of them didn't make it, but preserved this tradition until we could revisit it as a culture kind of in the 1980s. And you had, Blancpain and, subsequently AHCI and the rise of independent watchmaking. and now an intense focus on artistic crafts and finishing and whatnot. But if we hadn't had Vacheron AP and Patek to carry us through that time, this watch was 1961. Like there just wasn't anybody else doing stuff like this
Yeah,
back then, other than the Holy Trinity. And you could maybe make an argument. There was some Piaget here and there, and whatnot, but these were really on a different level. And I
yeah,
think that we owe a debt as watch collectors and enthusiasts to the Holy Trinity for what they gave to the world during that period, and we were able to build the industry that we all have now because these brands got us to this, got us well past the starting line. It
yeah,
would have been much harder to even figure out what fine watchmaking was, and communicate that to the market and find people who could do it and grow what we have without the contribution of those three brands during some really difficult years. And
yeah,
so, for me, I don't like the term Holy Trinity, but it certainly is not something that I think should be reevaluated. And this is a perfect example of
yeah.
why.
And I think even in the last, I would say 10, 15 years, Vacheron has lived up to it.
Hmm.
Maybe it's not been appreciated enough because the brand has been famous for the overseas and things like that. When actually it has created the three most complicated watches ever in the last 15 years, right? There were the two pocket watches,
Hmm.
uh, the 57-260 and the Berkeley, both went to the same guy. And this year it launched the Solaria, the most complicated wristwatch ever. So I think Vacheron is still doing some interesting things, and I think maybe it still has more up its sleeve for its anniversary this year that it'll launch later in the year.
That would be exciting.
Yeah. Okay. So are there any watches that stood out to you in the upcoming auction season from the catalogs you've seen so far?
It's interesting, to see the Constantine Chaikin, the Thin King.
Mm,
The I'm fresh off of writing the story about the Bulgari Octo Femminissimo Ultra Tourbillon, the thinnest tourbillon ever made at 1.85 millimeters thick.
mm,
Um, this is even thinner than that by
yeah.
about what,
Yeah.
2/10 of a millimeter.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
you know, these records, it's starting to get harder and harder to really care about them that much, just because the differences now are pretty much imperceptible. Like when Piaget launched the the AUC tourbillon last year at 2 millimeters. I mean, I think the prior record was Bulgari at, for the total watch thickness, somewhere between 3 and 4. So this was, nearly a 50%, nearly cut it in half. And then now we're shaving tenths of millimeters that
yeah.
are almost impossible to feel between
Yeah.
your fingers.
Yeah.
Um, so it's getting a little hard to get excited, but a watch that is coming up that does seem like a good value, at least to me,
Yeah.
still outside my price range. But the Haldeman H1 that's coming up
Mm,
uh, looks looks like it's in great shape, and you know that's a watch that to me really encompasses what independent watchmaking is all about, because it tells a story. It's basically an escapement model on the wrist
mm,
of a really huge, very light, elegant flying tourbillon in
yeah.
sort of the Helvig style.
Yeah.
And I think that this watch being powered by its three barrels, two that drive uh, the cage, and one that
Mm,
actually powers the escape wheel, just a phenomenal architecture.
yeah.
Very slept on watch in my opinion, and at this estimate range, I think a good deal.
Yeah, it's I think the estimate is less than retail, because retail I think now is, yeah, retail now is about 200 Swiss with a waiting list. And it's a very artisanal watch.
Hmm.
It's I appreciate it a lot. I think probably the design could do with a little bit more color. It's a little bit too monochromatic. But if you order one new from Haldeman himself, he'll customize it for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I've always this is always one that is high up in my just conception of the independent watchmaking landscape.
yeah. Okay. Anything else?
I did just wanted to just correct my earlier point. The Audemars Piguet for J.W. Benson at Philips, um, absolutely stunning craftsmanship in the escapement. There's some great high-end images of the free sprung balance with the cylindrical hairspring, diamond end stone, bimetallic balance. Um, it just did not get any better than that. So
Yeah.
that's where I'll leave it. But
And and the estimate is a very affordable. The low
yeah,
estimate is only 30,000 francs. And for that, you get two watches.
yeah. I sincerely hope that it goes for more than that, so that I don't feel like I missed out by not bidding.
Okay. Okay, cool. I think that's covers everything for today. And I think our next podcast will be after the Geneva auctions, where we will talk about some of the things that happened there. Yeah, and I guess
Yeah,
see you all then. See you in mid-May after the auctions.
yeah. Just a few weeks.
All
Won't be
right.
that long. All right. See ya.
Take care.